The world did not wake up to a new Cold War. It drifted into one. A US strike on Venezuela was not just a military action. It was a message. This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we will not allow rivals to operate here. Those words from US Secretary of State Marco Rubio redraw invisible borders, not on maps, but in power. Across the Pacific, China heard something else, a warning, a line being enforced. Because for Beijing, Latin America is not a backyard, it is a crossroads. $518 billion in trade, $303 billion in loans, ports, railways, oil. Venezuela was only the spark. The fire is much larger. If you care about where power is moving, how economies are pressured, and why distant conflicts suddenly matter to your life, stay with me. Because to understand what just happened, we need to step back and see how this rivalry was built, quietly, patiently, over decades. This story is not about Venezuela alone. It is about control and about who gets to decide the rules of an entire hemisphere. For the United States, Latin America has long been framed as strategic depth, close, familiar, non-negotiable. When Washington talks about non-hemispheric competitors, it is signaling a red line. China's presence is no longer seen as economic. It is treated as geopolitical intrusion. For China, the framing is the opposite. Latin America is part of a multipolar world, a region with sovereign choices, a partner, not a proxy. That clash of interpretations matters because both sides are now acting on them. The US emphasizes pressure, leverage, and exclusion. China emphasizes trade, finance, and infrastructure. These are not parallel strategies, they collide. And when strategies collide, smaller countries feel the force first. To understand why this confrontation feels inevitable today, we need to go back, not to ideology, but to the slow economic entanglement that changed the balance underneath everything. This rivalry did not appear overnight. It grew quietly, transaction by transaction, loan by loan. Over the past 2 decades, China embedded itself into Latin America's economic bloodstream, not with troops, but with trade. By 2024, trade reached $518 billion, second only to the United States, and still rising. Chinese banks followed commerce. Between 2000 and 2023, they extended roughly $303 billion in financing, often where Western capital hesitated, often with fewer political conditions. Then came the next phase: institutions, forums, frameworks. At the China CELAC Forum, Beijing did not just promise cooperation. It offered a new $9 billion plus credit line, denominated in renminbi, not dollars. That detail matters because currency is power. For Washington, this slow shift set off alarms. Supply chains, debt, standards, influence without soldiers. By the time the US reacted forcefully, the architecture was already in place. And history shows something crucial. When economics hardens into strategy, pressure soon follows. That pressure would soon find a flashpoint, and Venezuela was next. The attack on Venezuela was not accidental. It was catalytic. For years, Venezuela had balanced between powers: oil for loans, sovereignty for survival. In 2023, Caracas and Beijing announced a strategic partnership. On paper, it looked decisive. In reality, it was fragile. When US forces struck and Russian-flagged oil tankers were seized, something became clear. China would not intervene militarily. Not here, not now. Across Latin America, leaders noticed. Power was being tested in real time. For Washington, the message was strength. For Beijing, it was exposure. Venezuela's oil had long been used to repay Chinese loans, but suddenly control over that oil was uncertain. Two Chinese supertankers turned back, not because of markets, because of force. If you're watching closely, this moment matters, because it shows where promises stop and where power begins. And it raises a deeper question. If economics cannot protect partners under pressure, what is the system really built on? To answer that, we need to look beneath the headlines, at the mechanisms that decide who bends and who breaks. What you're seeing now is not chaos, it is structure. Beneath the headlines sits a hidden mechanism, one that rewards leverage, not loyalty. China's model in Latin America is economic gravity. Trade binds, loans entangle, infrastructure locks in time horizons measured in decades, ports, railways, energy flows. But this model has a limit. It assumes stability. It assumes contracts matter more than coercion. The US model is different. It is enforcement. Control financial choke points, control shipping lanes, control access to markets and technology. When Washington speaks of hidden costs in foreign assistance, it is not only warning others, it is justifying pressure. Espionage, cyber risk, strategic dependence. These arguments convert economics into security threats, and security threats justify action. Venezuela exposed the asymmetry. China can build systems, the US can disrupt them fast. That is the real mechanism at work. One side accumulates influence slowly, the other interrupts it suddenly. And once interruption becomes policy, every Chinese-backed asset in the region looks vulnerable. Which brings us to the next escalation, because Venezuela was not the end, it was the rehearsal. The tension did not cool after Venezuela, it accelerated, because once disruption works, it invites repetition. Washington's next leverage point is oil, and oil is debt. For years, Venezuelan crude repaid Chinese loans. Now that flow is uncertain, potentially severed. If those barrels stop moving to China, billions in outstanding loans become paper losses. That is not an economic detail, it is strategic pain. Earlier this week, two Chinese supertankers turned back mid-voyage. No sanctions announcement, no treaty, just risk. And risk changes behavior faster than rules. If Beijing absorbs the loss quietly, its credibility weakens. If it retaliates, the conflict widens. Options exist: rare earth restrictions, pressure on US companies in China, the unreliable entity list. None are symbolic, all carry global consequences. This is the second crisis, sharper, more dangerous, because now escalation is not about ideology, it is about assets. And once assets are targeted, no partnership feels secure. That fear is already spreading, not in capitals, but among ordinary people who live downstream from these decisions. If you live in Latin America, this rivalry is not abstract. It reaches you through prices, through jobs, through uncertainty. When oil shipments stop, revenues shrink, budgets tighten, inflation follows. When great powers compete, they don't announce it to households, they let markets deliver the message. You feel it when public services strain, when infrastructure projects stall, when governments are forced to choose sides, quietly, urgently. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Neither side is fighting for you. The US wants exclusion. China wants access. Both speak the language of partnership. Both act on the logic of power. You are not collateral damage. You are leverage. That is why awareness matters, because the first defense of sovereignty is understanding the forces pressing on it. If this analysis helps you see the system more clearly, share it, discuss it, question it, because silence is how pressure becomes normal. And as pressure builds at the local level, Its effects do not stay local for long. They ripple outward, across borders, across oceans. What happens in Latin America never stays there, because this region sits at the intersection of trade routes, energy flows, and strategic geography. Ports like Chancay in Peru are not just concrete and cranes. They are gateways, operated by Chinese state-owned companies, connected directly to Asian supply chains. To Washington, that is not commerce. It is potential dual-use infrastructure. Then there is the Panama Canal, a narrow passage, a global artery. When President Donald Trump talks about taking back the canal, he is not speaking nostalgically. He is signaling intent. Railways deepen the concern. The proposed bioceanic corridor, costing up to $80 billion, would link Pacific and Atlantic coasts, bypassing traditional US-controlled routes. Even waterways are contested. Argentina's decision to block a Chinese company from deepening a key transport channel aligned quietly with US pressure. This is how rivalry globalizes, not through declarations, through logistics. Every port questioned, every rail line scrutinized, every investment politicized. And as the map fills with friction points, one question dominates strategic thinking. Not who is winning today, but what happens next. Because systems under pressure do not drift forward, they snap. The future now splits into three paths. None are abstract, all are plausible. The first is restraint. The US tightens oversight but avoids broad seizures. China absorbs losses, recalibrates quietly. Latin America hedges. Growth slows, but systems hold. The second is managed confrontation. Assets are contested selectively. Oil flows are weaponized. Loans are renegotiated under pressure. China retaliates economically. Rare earths, market access. The third path is rupture. The US moves beyond Venezuela. Ports, canals, infrastructure. China responds asymmetrically. Supply chains fracture. Proxy conflicts emerge, not with armies, but with economies. History teaches one thing here. Systems don't collapse from pressure alone. They collapse when pressure meets miscalculation. And in a world where power is exercised faster than understanding, miscalculation becomes likely, which leaves us with a final question. What should we take from all this? This moment is not about choosing sides. It is about recognizing patterns. When great powers redraw spheres of influence, they rarely say it plainly. They act. Venezuela was not an exception. It was a signal. The United States is asserting control over its hemisphere, not rhetorically, operationally. China, for all its economic reach, has learned that influence without enforcement has limits. For the rest of us, the lesson is sharper. Power today moves through oil contracts, ports, credit lines, and currencies, not just missiles. If you want to understand the next decade, watch where pressure replaces persuasion, where trade becomes security, where geography becomes destiny again. This analysis does not end here, because Venezuela is not the last test, and Latin America is not the last arena. If you want to stay ahead of these shifts, follow this work. Share it with someone who thinks geopolitics is distant, because the world is reorganizing in real time, and the cost of not paying attention is always higher than we expect.